this is a worry on the surface, two-party preferred. We'll bring up these figures. So this is the other side of the equation for coalition. So 58-42, and again, the trend is the problem. But while that's bad enough, what's behind that is the bigger concern. If we go to the primary vote, it's not that Labor's surging among female voters. It's what's happening at the primary level. Since that election polling, the coalition down 9 to 28%. I'm stating the obvious, but women are half of the population. This is dire, Peter.
Yeah, it is. And in particular, when you look at urban areas where the Teal independent movement has really stolen a huge section of the coalition's traditional support base, appealing to voters on things like integrity and climate change. Meanwhile, some of the Conservative candidates that were the alternative were talking about things like trans people in sport that just don't matter to the average voter. So whilst it seems like a pretty silly hypothetical to say, oh, well, if this group of people didn't vote, or if that group of people didn't vote, then we'd be in dire straits. If there's not a deliberate and probably pretty drastic attempt to appeal to these voter groups over the life of the next parliament, then I think we can expect that the problem to get worse as this trend continues rather than better for the coalition.
Interesting as we look ahead, because on one level, you can take us through these figures. People are saying it wasn't a good year for the economy or their personal financial situation in 2022. That's no surprise. But they're optimistic around 2023, which, well, if you put this reading onto it, it's interesting because expectations are relatively high that Labor can steer the economy in a positive way in 2023. If they don't manage that, maybe there's some angst coming.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things happening here. As you said, absolutely no surprise that there's some pretty negative feelings about the economy at the moment. But if you look back at how people felt in the middle of the pandemic, it's actually improved a fair bit. The other thing is that traditionally, coalition parties tended to enjoy a much higher rating on performance amongst voters on the economy and these kinds of issues that are top of mind at the moment. And that's narrowed a fair bit over the last year or two. So cost of living in particular, the Labor Party is really appealing to people and being very disciplined in talking about that issue all of the time. So I think that whilst people are feeling the pinch at the moment in the way that we haven't really seen for 30 or so years since the 90s, people are hearing messages from the government that are giving them some reassurance.
Yeah, so taking through the numbers as to expectations then on 2023, I mean, this is pretty glass half full when we look at these figures, considering rate rises so far, according to what the experts, there are supposed to be more of them. I'm not sure we'll get as many as predicted, but I just find that interesting that that's the expectation of voters when we look at these numbers.
The Labor Party's been really consistent in telling people that they'll take responsibility and take control. And I think during the pandemic, what we learnt about really large groups of the population is that they actually expect government to intervene on these significant issues and that it can actually work. Our relatively good performance through this really difficult last couple of years, driven by state and federal governments, has shown voters that when there is a collaborative approach, when there's a consensus built around what the priorities are and what the possible solutions are, that a difference can be made. This could be part of the reason for that optimism.
Really interesting though, isn't it? 24% think it will be worse. So that does compare the overall year, but if there's a recession or something, suddenly only a quarter of people thought it would get worse. What will that do to their overall intention? Peter Stahel with Essential Media, thank you for your time. We'll talk again next year.